Okay, so something happened this week that I cannot stop thinking about. And it is not the gas prices, even though those are bad. It is not the mortgage numbers, even though those are bad too. It is a single sentence from a study that the Pentagon commissioned about the state of American power in the world. And the sentence used one specific word that I want you to hear. The word was collapsing. Not struggling. Not declining. Not facing headwinds. Collapsing. That was the word the United States Department of Defense used internally to describe the international order that America built after World War II. The people running the empire wrote a document saying the empire is collapsing. And then basically nobody talked about it. Now I have been doing this channel for a while. I have covered a lot of dark economic stories. And I try not to be the guy who screams that the sky is falling every single week because honestly that gets old and it stops meaning anything. But guys, what I am looking at right now is different. Because it is not one thing. It is everything at once. The dollar lost 10% of its value in the past year alone. The dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from 71% in 1999 to 56% today, and it is still falling. The Pentagon just asked for a $1.5 trillion military budget while cutting $73 billion from domestic programs at the same time. Europe is in a full panic trying to build a military from scratch because the American safety net is disappearing. And China is openly, publicly, out loud executing a plan to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency. All of that. Simultaneously. Right now. And here is the thing that actually keeps me up at night. The average Roman citizen in 300 AD had no idea their civilization was 175 years from being completely gone. They went to work. They complained about prices. They argued about politics. They watched entertainment to take their minds off things. They thought, well, we are still the most powerful civilization on Earth, so we must be fine. They were right about being powerful. They were catastrophically wrong about being fine. So today I want to show you exactly why the United States in 2026 is following Rome's collapse pattern step by step. Not as a metaphor. As a documented checklist. And what you should be doing about it right now, before the crowd figures it out. Because by the time this becomes the mainstream conversation, it will already be too late to act on it. Let's get into it. Here is something that got almost zero coverage this week because the Iran conflict is eating every headline. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has dropped from 71% in 1999 to just 56.3% today. That is a 15 percentage point drop over 25 years, and it is still moving in the same direction. Now, why does that matter to you personally? Think about it this way. The dollar being the world's reserve currency is like being the only landlord in a city where everyone has to rent from you regardless. Every country that wants to buy oil, every country that wants to do international trade, has to hold your currency. Has to buy your government bonds. Has to play by your rules. That is how you run a $36 trillion national debt and still have people lining up to lend you more money. And that position is eroding right now. The dollar fell 10% on a trade-weighted basis in the past year. That is a massive move for a currency of this size. And just this week, analysts published a piece about how Iran and China are using the Strait of Hormuz situation to directly push countries away from dollar-denominated trade. They described it as Iran and China taking aim at US dollar hegemony. Those are the actual words from the reporting. Meanwhile, China now settles roughly a third of its foreign trade in yuan. Up from 20% just in 2022. And Xi Jinping is not being subtle about the goal at all. He publicly called for the yuan to become what he described as a powerful currency with global reserve status. He is announcing the plan out loud, and nobody in the American media is really taking it seriously. Now I know someone in the comments is going to say, the yuan is only 2% of global reserves right now versus 56% for the dollar. This is not a real threat. And look, you are right that it is not a threat next week. But you know what also was not a threat next week? Rome's denarius losing its value. It took about 200 years to lose 95% of its silver content. They kept shaving silver out of the coin to pay for the legions. The coin still looked the same. Still said denarius on it. But it bought less every single year. The US dollar has lost more than 96% of its purchasing power since 1913. The mechanism is identical. Only the timeline is different. Okay, so let me walk through the actual Rome checklist because this is where it gets uncomfortable. Rome did not fall because a stronger army showed up and beat it. The Roman army was still one of the most powerful fighting forces on Earth when the whole thing fell apart. Rome fell from the inside. And there were very specific things that caused it. The military budget kept growing while everything else got cut. Right now, the fiscal year 2027 budget request is $1.15 trillion for the Pentagon plus an additional $350 billion in a separate military spending package on top of that. If Congress passes both, that is a $1.5 trillion military budget. A 44% jump in 1 year. And at the exact same time they proposed a 10% cut to non-military domestic spending. $73 billion less for healthcare, infrastructure, education. More legions, less roads. Rome did that. Check. The legislature stopped working. Rome's Senate got so paralyzed by factional rivalry that individual leaders started grabbing emergency powers just to get anything done. And slowly over decades that turned into emperors. Congress's approval rating right now is around 13%. 13%. Nearly 9 out of 10 Americans do not approve of the job Congress is doing. And yet nothing changes. Check. The class divide got too wide. The thing that hollowed out the Roman middle class was the slow expansion of slave labor from conquered territories undercutting the wages of every free Roman worker. The middle class became economically dependent. They needed government handouts just to survive. The Romans called this policy bread and circuses. And the bottom 50% of Americans today hold less than 3% of the nation's wealth. The top 1% hold more than the bottom 90% combined. Check. The currency got quietly debased to pay for military operations the public did not support. A YouGov survey during the Iran conflict found that about 60% of Americans opposed the current military operation. The majority. And yet the Pentagon budget goes up 44%. The debt goes up. The dollar weakens. Check. Look, I am not saying America falls next year. Rome's decline took generations. But the Romans in the early stages kept saying, well, we are still the most powerful civilization on Earth, so we must be fine. They were right about being powerful. They were very wrong about being fine. Okay, so here's a story you keep hearing right now that I think is being completely misread. The idea that Europe is stepping up. That all of this is forcing European countries to finally get serious about their own defense and emerge as a real power. And this is being framed as a positive development, a sign of strength. Let me give you the actual numbers. Global defense spending hit $2.63 trillion in 2025. Up from $2.48 trillion in 2024. Yes, a lot of that increase came from Europe. Germany just changed its own constitution to exempt defense from its debt limits. That is a genuinely historic move, and I get why it is being reported as Europe getting its act together. But here is what those same reports are leaving out. Analysts at the Bruegel Institute actually ran the numbers on what it would take for Europe to replace what the US currently provides militarily. The answer: 300,000 additional troops and at least 250 billion euros per year in extra spending. Just to reach baseline. Not to surpass the US. Just to cover the gap. And even with all of that, they said Europe still cannot fully close it without access to the American defense industrial base. The actual factories and supply chains and technology that European defense currently runs on top of. So what you are watching is not a new superpower being born. What you are watching is Europe realizing in a state of genuine panic that it has been freeloading on American security for 80 years and the bill just arrived at the door. Britain is the most dramatic example of this. Britain once had the most powerful navy on Earth. They kept global shipping lanes open for 2 centuries. That same Britain today has a navy that its own defense analysts say struggles to meet basic defensive obligations. That is a stunning collapse from what they were. And if Britain is in that position, just imagine where the rest of Europe actually is. One analyst described the EU's entire post-Cold War strategy as the delusion of soft power. The bet was, we have international law, we have institutions, we have the rules-based order, we do not need armies. And then reality showed up. And it turns out an agreement without force behind it is not really an agreement. It is a wish. And while America ramps up military spending and Europe figures out how to build an army from scratch, China is doing something completely different. China is not scrambling. China is running a very specific plan. From 2008 to 2023, US GDP grew from roughly equal to the entire EU to a full third larger. Apple, one American company, is worth more than the entire economy of Canada. American AI dominance is real, and I am not dismissing any of it. But here is what China has been quietly building the whole time. A third of its foreign trade now settles in yuan. Its trade surplus could hit $1.5 trillion in 2026. $1.5 trillion in surplus. While the US runs deficits so large that interest payments on the $36 trillion national debt are now the single biggest line item in the entire federal budget. Bigger than Social Security. Bigger than Medicare. Bigger than the entire military budget was 10 years ago. And this is where it hits everyone personally. Because the US and China are so economically intertwined right now that a real breakdown between them does not just produce a geopolitical story. It produces a grocery bill story. A gas price story. A mortgage payment story. You are already living it. The tariff situation alone has already filtered into prices on basically everything you buy. And that is before we are even talking about what a real decoupling looks like. In the 3rd century AD, Rome and China were the two biggest civilizations on Earth, and they barely interacted. They were on opposite ends of the Silk Road. Today there is no buffer. It is all connected. Which means when this relationship breaks badly, it breaks everywhere at once. And just this week, reporting out of the Strait of Hormuz situation describes Iran and China jointly maneuvering to push global oil trade away from the dollar. That is not a distant future scenario. That is happening right now, this week, while most people are focused on the military angle of the story and missing the economic angle entirely. You know, I think it is easy to hear numbers like $36 trillion in debt and $1.5 trillion military budget and have your brain just skip past them because they are too big to feel real. So let me give you the version that is real. Restaurant sales are falling every single week. Fast food, which was always supposed to be the cheap option when your budget was tight, now runs $12 to $18 per person. Gas is up over $1 per gallon in about a month since the conflict started. Mortgage delinquencies jumped 25% in just 4 months. And Google searches for "help with my mortgage" just hit the highest level ever recorded. Higher than before the 2008 crash. More people right now are searching for mortgage help than were searching for it during the lead-up to the worst housing collapse in modern American history. This is what street-level imperial decline actually looks like. Not in a textbook. On the street where you live. It is not people starving. It is people who were getting by last year who cannot get by this year. People working 2 or 3 jobs and still falling behind. Fast food becoming a luxury purchase. And the Rome parallel here is so direct it is almost uncomfortable to say out loud. The Romans in the final centuries of the empire were not starving either. The bread still came. The games still ran. But the middle class, the small farmers, the craftsmen, the merchants who had been the backbone of the whole thing, had been slowly crushed. By slave labor undercutting their wages. By taxes going up to pay for the legions. By a currency that bought less every single year. And the Roman leadership knew exactly what they were doing. They called the policy bread and circuses themselves. Subsidized food and entertainment spectacle to keep a hollowed-out population quiet. 60% of Americans oppose the current military operation. The majority. And yet the Pentagon budget goes up 44% in 1 year. And domestic spending gets cut by $73 billion. And people search for mortgage help at record levels. All at the same time. That is not bad luck. That is a pattern that has a name. So look. I do not want to just leave you in a dark place with all of that. So let me tell you what I think you should actually do. The most important thing I can tell you is the same thing I have been saying for years, and the urgency on it right now is higher than it has ever been. Your financial security cannot depend on the government. Any government. Rome's middle class trusted the system. Britain's working class trusted the system. The system protected itself first every single time throughout history. There is no reason to think this time is different. So build your own buffer. 6 months of living expenses minimum, liquid and accessible. Not locked in a retirement account with penalties to withdraw. Not tied up in real estate you cannot quickly sell. Actual cash you can reach in an emergency. And if you already have that buffer, right now is the time to make sure it is sitting where it needs to be. And look honestly at where your income comes from. If it is heavily tied to government contracts, cheap imported goods, or stable low energy prices, think hard about that. Those are the areas most exposed to everything I just walked through. And honestly, just pay attention. Not to the political noise on cable news. Pay attention to the dollar index. Import price data. Mortgage delinquency rates. Manufacturing orders. Energy prices. Those are the signals that tell you what is actually happening in the real economy, as opposed to what the press release says. You know, the people who came through Rome's decline were not the most powerful or the most politically connected. They were the ones who read the shift early. Who moved before everyone else did. Before it was obvious. Before the crowd moved. That is the only playbook that has ever worked in situations like this one. Maybe I am wrong about all of this. I genuinely hope I am. But the data is what it is, and I would rather give it to you straight and have you prepared for something that does not happen than have you blindsided by something that does. Make sure you are subscribed and check that you are actually still subscribed, because YouTube keeps doing that thing where people get dropped without knowing it. If you want to keep going, there is another video on screen right now. I will see you there.